Figurative language, lesson 4 of 4 on how to analyze a text. For the other three, syntax, tone, and diction, find it on my channel. Now, these are the elements I'm going to be covering today. I am not covering all the elements because they are not pertinent to the AP English Language and Composition exam, meaning these are the ones that show up in our exam, in our text, more often. So I will cover those. Now, analogy is the first one I'll begin with. Analogy, as you know, is a comparison of one pair to another. When a writer uses an analogy, the idea is to establish a relationship between a thing and another thing, but down to its specific things. So if I can give you an example of what I'm saying, look at the FRQ from 2004 nude statues. In this example, you're not comparing public libraries to public museums. That's not what's happening here. It's not like saying, in a simile sort of way, a public library is like a public museum, meaning they both host or they house art and information and things like that. No, the idea here is what's being compared is the admittance of censored material in public libraries. That is being analogized to the admittance of nude statues or statues that or painting that is revelatory of the body in public museums. So, for instance, it is universally admitted that public libraries must reserve certain books from general circulation. In the same way, it is reasonable to affirm that a public museum of art may be justified in excluding certain statues. Every librarian knows what books to reserve for the exclusive use of persons of mature age. Every curator of every museum is likewise bound to admit, yada, yada, yada. The example being presented here is that the writer is comparing the restriction of nude statues in museums to the limited inclusion of books containing sensitive material in libraries. Why? Because the writer wants museums to admit nude statues, or a very specific one that he has in mind. So the argument he's making is, well, if public libraries include or allow certain books that are censored or contain sensitive material, why can public museums allow, nudity in art if they both can be put in a separate room? So this analogy provides an easy way for the writer to validate his solution to the problem of accepting nude statues in public museums, right? Now, the metaphor, though it is also a comparison, it's an implied comparison that makes both things compared equal in relation. Think of metaphors as perfect comparisons, since they figuratively make one thing into another, right? You're not like a flower; you are blooming under the sun. In this example of the Great Influenza FRQ 2008, what is being compared, or metaphorized, I should say, is the scientific endeavor and the pursuit of science as the trekking of the wilderness. The two are being compared. Let me give you an example. All real scientists exist on the frontier. Even the least ambitious among them deal with the unknown only if one step beyond the known. The best among them move deep into the wilderness region where they know almost nothing, where the very tools and techniques needed to clear the wilderness to bring order to it do not exist. They probe in a disciplined way. So, words like scientists on the frontier, right? And then going into the unknown, and then moving deep into the wilderness region, right? Tools and techniques, probing, these are all examples of how the writer is using the social metaphor of going into the wilderness as a way of comparing the scientific method and exploration to the survival in the wilderness. The use of such a primitive and relatable metaphor helps appeal to our shared understanding of survival and paints science as a vigorous and dangerous endeavor. Now, similes, on the other hand, are imperfect comparisons. They say that one thing is like the other, only partially, while metaphors say that the thing is the other. So, for example, from the same FRQ, and if they are at least partly correct, their probing acts like a crystal to precipitate an order out of chaos. Okay, like a crystal. Now, comparing research or their probing of a scientist to a crystal, it alludes to the aforementioned looking glass previously in the text of science, which provides a clear lens of understanding. So if we can put all three together, the metaphor is the perfect comparison. It essentially says that one thing is the other. The simile says that a quality of a thing is like the quality of another. An analogy, which by the way, analogies are embedded both in similes and in metaphors, so both metaphors and similes have analogies within them. An analogy says that the aspects of one thing are as the aspects of another thing. Now, let's move on to the other set of related elements. Parallelism. Also known as parallel structure, parallelism consists of a sentence construction that places equal grammatical structures near each other. What am I saying? It is used to add emphasis and it essentially mimics itself throughout the text, saying possibly the same thing, except not in the same words, though they may include one word or another that are the same. So, for instance, look at these examples from the Florence Kelly FRQ 2011. With the Georgia legislature, here she is arguing against child labor. Would the Georgia legislature have refused at every session for the last 3 years to stop the work in the mills of children under 12 years of age? With the New Jersey legislature, and so on. She repeats this two more times throughout the text. So this would be a parallel structure. Now, when you're writing about parallelism, what you want to do is you want to point out how that repetition is meaningful. So, Kelly illustrates the negligence of children on the adults' behalf through the creation of a parallel structure throughout lines, calling them beasts of burden who have been robbed of school life. She mentions how they spin, they stamp, they carry. So these are also ideas that are parallel throughout the text. They spin, they stamp, they carry. Little beasts of burden, robbed of school life. These are all similar ideas that are, again, they have a structure all throughout the text, that the same idea is being repeated. That is the implication of a parallel structure. Now, this creates a blanket of guilt upon the women, further motivating the pursuit of female suffrage in order to end injustice of child labor. Now, an anaphora, which is a kind of parallel structure where the repetition is of a word or a phrase, and that word or phrase is repeated several times in a meaningful way and often at the beginning of the sentence. Look at the JFK steel example from 2012. It would make it more difficult for American goods to compete in foreign markets, more difficult to withstand competition from foreign imports, and thus more difficult to improve. They often come in threes. Think about Martin Luther King, I have a dream and I have a dream and I have a dream. Or the very beginning of that speech where he says, but 100 years later, but 100 years later, but 100 years later. The repetition of these phrases are often meaningful and they are paralleled like so in order to create attract attention to what is being said, right? So it's for emphatic purposes. If you want to see an example and explanation of what I'm talking about, let's look at Kelly's text one more time. So Kelly begins turning her agenda towards women's suffrage. When she does that, she places blame on both herself and everyone in the audience for supporting child labor, whether directly or indirectly. She uses the anaphora when listing all the items produced by children, denoting that children make our shoes, knit our stockings, they braid straw for our hats. The repetition of the word our both enforces her belief that the blame is shared throughout the country, and it guarantees at least one of the clothing items can apply to anyone in the audience. So this anaphora challenges the audience and Kelly herself in their integrity, right? So this is an example of how an anaphora can be meaningful if you say what it means. You don't just say, she repeats, make our shoes, knit our stockings. Yeah, these things are repeated, but why are they repeated? Well, because this repetition is about saying that we have all to blame because we're all wearing those clothes. So whenever you are talking about any element, you have to make it meaningful. Now let's look at irony. Irony is a really big one, a very common one. When you think of irony, think that the intended meaning differs from actual meaning. Think of it like that. So if it's verbal irony, often the opposite of what is meant is said, but in a way that you can still arrive at the actual meaning. So situational irony is when the opposite of what is expected occurs. And dramatic irony we don't really talk about because we don't see it in these texts, but this is the one that we see on stage, on TV shows, on movies, It's when the characters don't know something that we, the audience, know. Now, let's look at this whole example of irony from the 2006 FRQ. And we're not going to read it. But essentially, he begins by saying that one cannot get on in this world without money. We need money. Then to be in want of money is to have a terrible life. But as he goes through all the examples, essentially he proves one point, which is you can have a good life without money. Money is not substantial for living. Though it is important for living, it isn't the only thing that makes life worth living. So the language here is implicit of its opposite. So while he is saying that to be in want of money is to have a terrible life, when you read it again, you realize it's not to be in want as in not having. He means to be in want of, to be constantly seeking for money. That's the real problem. So in this example of irony, what we're looking at here is we're looking at both hyperboles and understatements, because these are components of ironies. Hyperboles exaggerate while understatements minimize. The idea here is that by stretching your words in either one direction or the other, you are arriving at the same point. So here's a hyperbole from The Onion. By the way, these two examples are satiric examples, and that's where you'll find those most commonly. So the FRQ 2005 from The Onion. So magnasols employ a brand new cutting-edge form of pseudoscience known as pteronometry, developed specifically for integrated products by some of the nation's top pseudoscientists. Here, the author is hyperbolizing marketing strategies, exaggerating, right, this brand new cutting-edge form of pseudoscience known as pteronometry. So there's a hyperbole happening here and here, literally and truly. Here are the things that create the hyperbole. One cannot get on well in this world. One cannot get on well in this world without money, right? The implication by beginning the on a want of money text like that is that it dramatizes the meaninglessness of living life without money. But literally and truly, one cannot get on well in the world without money. Literally and truly, you cannot live without money. Come on. So the understatement, however, what it does is that it minimizes something only to attract attention to it, to say, look, this is really important. So I minimize it so that when you look at it, you say, wait, you shouldn't be minimizing that. That's how the understatement works. Now, look at this Claire Booth Luce example from the FRQ 2017. What is good journalism all about? And now she gives you a very lengthy definition. On a working finite level, it is the effort to achieve illuminating candor in print and strip away cant. It is the effort to do this not only in matters of state, diplomacy, politics. It is the effort to explain everything from the summit. It is the effort to, by the way, that's an anaphora, to describe the lives of men and women, big and small, close at hand, yada, yada, yada. It is to use the big word, the pursuit of, and the effort to state the truth. Now, what's being understated here is not the highlighted portion. It's everything else. And that's the point. The point is that by the time you get to truth, which seems like such a small word, by the time you get to that last word, truth, you've understated everything you've said, thereby implying that everything you've said can be summarized into one word, truth. So you're understating all of this verbiage about good journalism, illuminating candor, stripping away cant, speaking about matters of state and diplomacy, explaining everything from a summit conference to why the moon looks larger, right? Describing the lives of men and women, big and small, close at hand or thousands of miles away. The idea of the understatement is that you are drawing attention to a thing, much like you were with hyperbole. So in this case, it is to use the big word, the pursuit of truth, to state the truth. It exemplifies the importance of keeping true to the values of being a true journalist. Now, let's look at another set of examples. Allusion, and these are some of the last examples. Allusion, which is an indirect reference or a cross-reference to something with which the reader is familiar. It's often historical, sometimes a book. It could be a play or a song, historical event, things like that. Now, to allude is to reference a thing. So when Luce begins her speech saying, alluding to having biblical allusions, saying that she was invited to throw rocks at her audience, the informality of the biblical allusion helps ease the tension in the audience, since only he who is without sin can throw the first stone. I mean, that's the implication of that allusion, right? And then she strings these biblical allusions by claiming that she's exposing the follies and sins of her listeners. and describing the delicate art of giving an audience hell. Now, these are meant to ease the audience. She was invited there to talk to them about the state of affairs when it comes to journalism, and she's supposed to be critical. So, what does she begin by doing? By saying, well, you invited me to throw rocks at you. It's funny, yes, but the implication of this allusion is that I am not Jesus. I cannot throw the first stone. I am not without sin. Therefore, I will deal kindly with you. That's the implication, because people are a little tense in an example like that, in a moment like that. Imagery, it's when you use words to create a picture in the reader's mind. Now, imagery is often used in conjunction with other things like metaphors and similes. Now, here's an example of imagery. Tonight, while we sleep, several thousand little girls will be working in textile mills all night through, and the deafening noise, here we go, of the spindles and the looms spinning and weaving cotton, wool, silks, and ribbons for us to buy. I mean, you can almost imagine somebody sleeping and another image of a little girl working in a textile mill. A little girl on her 13th birthday could start away from home at 5:30 in the afternoon carrying a pail of midnight luncheon, as happier people carry their midday luncheon. It could work in the mill from 6 at night until 6 in the morning without violating any law of the Commonwealth. Now, these moments of imagery, they narrate a little girl's journey to and from work in order to dramatize the evil of child labor. The use of an image like that helps create an empathic connection between the general idea of underage work and an audience who previously didn't know enough to care. So the basic idea is this. Once they see it, a little girl carrying her lunch, working 12 hours a night, once they see it, they cannot ignore it. That's the implication of the imagery. So, in conclusion, when writing about figurative language, you want to do more than simply tell me what the thing is. Abigail Adams uses a simile when she compares her son's journey to Paris to a river growing away from its source. So what? Nobody cares. You have to tell me more than what it is, right? You have to tell me more than where it is, though those two things are important. You got to tell me what it does, and you got to tell me why it matters. So the last example here is she compares her son's journey to Paris to a river growing into the sea, because they both leave the little streams of knowledge and influence into a notion of opportunity. And then I say why it matters. An apt simile, considering that her son would have spent the past few months on a ship, and this comparison may have been more personal to him. That is what I mean. When writing about figurative language, you got to tell me why that matters, and how does it work. Okay, well, that's been the lesson on figurative language. I'll see you on the drive.